so happy to be here today and talk to you about this project that I've been working on. I'd like to begin with a land acknowledgement. So I'm currently located on the land known as Takaranto, which has been cared for by the Anishinaabe Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Huron-Wendat. I acknowledge that the current treaty holders, the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. This territory is subject of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, which is an agreement to peaceably share and care for the Great Lakes region. So this research that I'm going to be talking about today was conducted through ODLIN, which stands for the Open Digital Literacy and Access Network. ODLIN is a nonprofit organization that works to remove digital literacy and access barriers for us LGBTQIA+ people and communities. ODLIN creates resources, hosts training sessions, and conducts research to work toward more equitable online experiences for us LGBTQIA+ people. This research is part of the project entitled Digital Resilience, Addressing the Rise of Transphobic Online Hate Through Community-Based Research. And it's a partnership between ODLIN and Wisdom to Action. We received funding for this project from the federal government, specifically the Digital Citizen Contribution Program. So I'm going to just quickly introduce some key terms that will be used in this presentation and are used throughout the research. Transphobic online hate is an umbrella term that refers to all forms of online hate that are rooted in transphobia. So online hate is also an umbrella term that refers to things such as cyberbullying, harassment, cyber violence, cyber stalking, doxing, swatting, and digital to physical violence. And this project's focusing specifically on online hate that is targeting 2STM+ people. And we use the acronym 2STM+ to stand for Two-Spirit, Trans, and Non-Binary People, with the plus being inclusive of gender non-conforming and intersex individuals. This project included several research and community-focused components, including an online survey and one-on-one interviews with 2STM+ professionals, a 2STM+ research advisory committee, an online peer support group for 2STM+ professionals, and a feasibility study on developing a reporting tool for anti-2SLGBTQIA+ online hate. At the beginning of the research process, we formed an advisory committee, and they provided guidance and feedback throughout the research process. We also submitted an ethics application to York University. So the objectives of this project and purpose of this research project is to better understand how transphobic online hate is directed at organizations that serve 2STM+ or 2SLGBTQIA+ populations in Canada, and more specifically, how this impacts 2STM+ staff. So we had three primary objectives. One, to determine the impacts that transphobic online hate is having on 2STM+ professionals. Two, to uncover the strategies that these professionals and their organizations are already using to mitigate and respond to transphobic online hate. And to develop recommendations for organizations to address this hate. So the online survey had three eligibility criteria. You had to identify as 2STM+, be 18 years of age or older, and work for a Canadian organization that serves queer or trans communities. It ran from October to November 2024 on SurveyMonkey, and we received a total of 56 valid responses. There were 31 questions, and the questions did have skipped logic, so not everyone completed every question or provided an answer. The one-on-one interviews, the eligibility was the same as the survey, but you also had to have already experienced transphobic online hate within a professional context. The interviews were approximately 1 hour long and had 17 questions. And we interviewed a total of 12 participants between October and November 2024. The survey data was analyzed using content analysis to identify patterns, themes, and meaning. The interview data used thematic analysis to interpret the key themes from the data with a focus on intersectionality. We then synthesized the findings from the survey and the interviews. And we then found these overlapping topics and themes that we organized into 3 sections. So experiences of transphobic online hate, impacts of transphobic online hate, and responses to transphobic online hate. I'm going to be focusing specifically on the survey findings since we have limited time, but our final report, which is available on our website, does include their findings from both the survey and the interviews. So the survey found that 80% of people who completed it had experienced transphobic online hate that was directed either at them or their organization. This was most commonly experienced on social media, and the target of transphobic online hate was often the organizations or the 2STM+ community as a whole, and gender nonconforming and non-binary identities. We asked about the triggers for transphobic online hate, if there were any precipitating events, for instance, or things that contributed to a rise in experiencing this online hate. And people shared that often it was in response to promoting content about or for 2STM+ people, including days of significance, or when 2STM+ issues were being discussed in the media, including when there were changes to laws or policies. The platforms that this most commonly occurred was Facebook, X or Twitter, and Instagram, and it was often through both public posts and DMs. We also asked about common rationale or the language that was used to justify the transphobic online hate. And some of the key discourses that surfaced were protecting children or similar language, particularly this the terminology of parental rights or traditional family values. And another common rationale was often rooted in biological determinism and a rejection of, quote, gender ideology. And this sometimes came from folks who self-identified as gender critical and as well individuals who'd be identified as trans exclusionary radical feminists. In terms of the impacts of transphobic online hate, several negative impacts were identified. Individuals reported that they had reduced or limited their online presence, particularly in social media, both personally and professionally. They shared less information about themselves on social media and online, and had a heightened sense of vigilance. They also reported negative impacts on their mental health, including anxiety, fear, exhaustion, burnout, and CPTSD. When asked about responses to transphobic online hate, we focused primarily on policies and strategies that organizations have implemented or that they could implement. So some of the responses included that organizations were often monitoring for transphobic online hate and would often block accounts that shared online hate. They would delete the comments and report them to social media platforms, although it was also noted that this was largely unsuccessful at stopping the online hate or stopping people from resharing the posts. They also limited the identifiable information about employees online, so that included removing email addresses or last names, pronouns, and things like that. In terms of strategies, when asked what staff would like to see from their organizations, they did call for clearer policies and protocols, and most importantly, for more mental health supports for dealing with transphobic online hate. Our final report does include recommendations that came from our analysis of the data. These are founded in the principles of intersectionality, anti-racism, and anti-oppression. and they're meant to help 2S LGBTQIA+ organizations address transphobic online hate and support their 2STM+ staff members. We also emphasize that these recommendations should be focused on to meet the needs of BIPOC and other marginalized 2STM+ folks, and to incorporate a harm reduction and trauma-informed approach when possible. Our recommendations are: 1, to develop and implement formal policies. This includes anti-discrimination and sexual harassment policies, privacy policies, including what can be posted online, and social media and online hate policies, including codes of conduct, protocols for what to do when someone experiences transphobic online hate, and documenting it. 2, to engage in frequent and consistent communication of policies, strategies, and supports provided by the organization so that staff know what supports are actually available to them. To provide additional training and resources for all members on topics including how to mitigate and respond to transphobic online hate, how to promote digital safety and online security, and how to support victims of transphobic online hate while being sensitive to 2STM+ people's experiences with harm. 4, to provide resources and supports for 2STM+ members impacted by transphobic online hate, including access to mental health supports. To partner with organizations to provide additional support for marginalized members if that support cannot be adequately provided internally. And finally, to create a safety plan for in-person and virtual events and activities that are hosted by the organization to ensure everyone's prepared to address transphobic online hate if or when it happens. These are expanded on in the final report, and further examples and tips are provided for increasing online safety in general. I do want to quickly note there were limitations, of course, to this research and to this project. We did have very narrow criteria to participate, as we were focusing on 2STM+ folks working in queer and trans nonprofits. And we were seeking input from a marginalized group in an under-resourced and overburdened sector. So our findings are not representative of all 2STM+ people or all queer and trans organizations across Canada. And we did have an overrepresentation of people from Ontario. You can download the final report at odlin.ca/research-report-2023. There's also a QR code that I've included here on the presentation, which hopefully will work through the screen. But if not, again, you can find our final report at odlin.ca or odlin.ca/research-report-2023 to learn more about transphobic online hate and how to mitigate and address it. Thank you so much, everyone.
Hello, so I'm going to be speaking today about trans technologies, and this is a 15-minute version of a talk, but this is actually related to a book that I just released. So this is kind of a shortened version of the book talk that I usually give. And as I'm sure is not a surprise to anyone here, this is a really difficult time for trans people. And I'm coming from a US context, so a lot of what I'm speaking about is about what's happening in the US. And recently there was this executive order by our president that basically said that there are only 2 genders and that those genders cannot change. And this has had so many implications for things like identity, passports, prisons, military service, medical care, schools, and just many other ways that this has really negatively impacted trans people. And there are ways that trans people are using technology to fight back against some of these anti-trans political climate. So this is one example. This is called Trans Family Network. And this actually came about a couple years ago. So when I was doing the research for this project, this was right when we were first starting to see some anti-trans proposed legislation. Some bills were passing in states like Texas and Florida. And there needed to be a way to connect some of the people who needed help with people who could provide support. And so, for example, if you were a family in Texas who had a trans child and you were not able to get health care in that state, you might need to travel to a different state to get health care. And people in those situations would need things like perhaps transportation support, financial resources, as well as emotional support, things like this. And at the time, people were connecting on Twitter, which was a very different platform at that time, of course, but they were using a Google spreadsheet so people could put in some of their needs there, and then other people could say, hey, I can help out with that. But the spreadsheet became very chaotic. So you can imagine, with anyone was able to edit the spreadsheet. And so people didn't necessarily feel safe accepting support when they didn't really know who that person was. So this app, Trans Family Network, came about to formalize that spreadsheet using this technological system. And the creators of this tool met also on Twitter. It was a group of mostly trans women, mostly software engineers, and some of them took about 2 weeks off of work to create this Trans Family Network system. And it formalized what was happening in the spreadsheet, but it also had a very complex vetting mechanism so that people really could feel safe accepting support from the people that wanted to provide support. So this is just one example of ways that trans people are using technology as forms of resistance against the current political climate. And so I've been talking about trans technology, but I haven't defined it yet. So here is what I mean by trans technology. And I actually have two different definitions because these come from interviews that I did with over 100 creators of trans technology. And I asked each of them what that phrase meant to them. And that's what I distilled into these two definitions. So this first one is the more practical definition of technology that addresses the unique needs and challenges faced by trans people and communities. And it's often designed in response to the lack of trans inclusion in more mainstream technologies. So you could imagine this would be something like a hormone tracking app, something like that. But then there's also this more theoretical definition, and this is drawing from queer theory and trans studies, and it's technology that embraces change and or transition. It fosters the creation of new trans worlds, and it opens up new possibilities for what technology means and what it can do. And I'll give some examples later in the talk about this one. So the book is actually available free open access on the website of MIT Press. So if you want to read it, it's absolutely free. I did actually bring a few copies if anyone is interested in purchasing one, just let me know. I'd be happy to sign it as well. I also have free stickers if anyone wants stickers. But so a few key concepts that run across the book. First is technological transcare, and the second is ambivalence. So there's this concept called transcare, and this is coming from Hill Malatino's work, and this is trans people showing up for each other, supporting each other, and helping to address each other's needs in the absence of support from mainstream systems. And so an example of this would be, let's say if one person gets a gender-affirming surgery and another person cares for them during their recovery. And from transcare, I developed this concept of technological transcare. And that's trans people creating innovative technological mechanisms to support each other and to address the needs that they and their communities face when mainstream systems and technologies often reject or exclude them. And so this is an example here of TransCare Plus, which is a care directory that provides really important resources for trans people. This is actually a Canadian tool, and I think it's unfortunately no longer around, which is really sad. But I think still it's a really good example to show what I mean here. And so I argue that trans technology is often a form of trans care, but it's a little bit different because instead of being one-to-one as one person providing care for someone after surgery, this can reach wide audiences. So the creators of this TransCare Plus site would not even know all of the people that it's impacting, all of the people that are using it. And I think that's really important. And then alongside technological trans care, the other key theme here is ambivalence. And this means that several seemingly incompatible things can actually be true at the same time. And I found that a lot of trans tech creators navigated tensions between competing emotions and goals and desires that they experienced simultaneously. And so I want to give an example here. This is a tweet that I came across near the beginning of 2022 from someone named Sasha Winter, who I interviewed for the book. And this was right after all of these laws were starting to come out in some of these US states, and people were very angry. And Sasha decided to channel that anger and rage into something called a game jam that she was calling Trans Fucking Rage Jam. And before I did this research, I actually didn't really know what a game jam was, but it is basically someone comes up with a theme and then a bunch of people come together and create their own games based on that theme. So there's usually a certain aesthetic, certain types of fonts and things like that. And so at the same time, she also created an online community on a Discord server where people came together and worked together on their games and formed a community around it. And these were the entries. There were 82 different games that were submitted. And you can see they are all using this kind of dark and moody color scheme. They have similar types of fonts, themes, things like that. And so this was a really important way for people to be able to channel that rage into creativity. But then a few months later, I was on Twitter again, and I saw that Sasha had posted this. It's a new game jam called the Trans Joy Jam. And you can see that the color scheme is completely different. It's a rainbow, it has sparkles, it's all about being joyous. And this happened just a few months later. This was in the summer of the same year. And this is what some of the submissions looked like for this one. You can see completely different color scheme, completely different types of themes. And so what I'm arguing here is that rage and joy are experienced simultaneously, even though it seems like these are in conflict. So it's not that in March and April, everyone was filled with anger and rage, and then suddenly over the summer, everyone was suddenly filled with joy. It's that these two complex emotions exist at the same time. And so from there, I want to go into some of the primary arguments of the book. The first is that creating trans technology can be powerful and empowering because technology creators have this agency to create the tools that they themselves and sometimes the broader community need to navigate the world. But sometimes when trans communities are not involved in design processes, this can lead to these overly individualistic designs that speak primarily to more privileged trans people's needs. So I started to realize after a while that many of the creators of trans technology were more likely to be white, more likely to be very highly educated, more likely to be of higher socioeconomic status, access to resources, all of these types of things. And so I argue that trans technology creation can have the most impact and best address trans needs if diverse community members are meaningfully involved in design processes. And so as I start to wrap up here, this is the primary takeaway that I want to leave you with. So the first part is that technology helps us imagine new possibilities for trans people and communities. But at the same time, trans experiences help us imagine new possibilities for technology. And so for this first category, I think Trans Family Network is a really nice example of that, because this is helping trans people in unique ways using technology that they may not have considered otherwise. And then for this second part, where trans experiences help us imagine new possibilities for technology, I want to tell you about this example of Chelsea Manning. So she is a famous whistleblower in the US, and she was in prison for a number of years. And when she was in prison, that was when she was transitioning. and nobody knew what she looked like. And there was a magazine that wanted to do a feature on Chelsea, but they were not allowed to send a photographer into the prison. And so instead, they hired an artist named Heather Dewey Hagborg, who's someone that I was able to interview for the study. And Heather is a DNA phenotyping artist. And so she worked with Chelsea and basically got some DNA samples from Chelsea, things like hair samples, cheek swabs. And then she was able to create all of these different versions of what Chelsea might look like. And they called this project Probably Chelsea. And one thing they were able to do that was really interesting is they could adjust the computer code so that they would not create any male versions of Chelsea. They would only create either female or gender neutral versions. And so this is kind of what that ended up looking like. And this is a picture of Chelsea after she got out of prison, coming face to face with these potential versions of herself. And so I think this is a really unique example of a use of technology that stemmed from trans experiences, but really brought technology in this innovative new direction that they wouldn't have thought of otherwise. And so I want to end on an optimistic note by reading a short excerpt from the book that I think demonstrates my optimism, even in the face of very difficult times. Although I will say that every day I'm less and less optimistic. But as we continue to search for ways to emerge from the toxic climate that trans people are currently forced to inhabit, we can set our sights on trans technologies on the horizon and start to build those technologies that help us escape transphobic worlds. I personally tend toward a more optimistic utopian view. I have immense hope for those 16-year-olds sitting in their bedrooms in their parents' houses, or in libraries, or in youth drop-in centers, hacking at their keyboards to create browser extensions. Those vast armies of trans game creators channeling their rage and creativity into trans game jams, and all those people building new technologies to help address the challenges their community faces. Each of these creators are ripples extending out from earlier trans technologies that have inspired them. And at the same time, there are also new objects breaking the surface, and they will inspire waves of future trans technologies spreading out across the water toward the horizon. Thank you.
All right. So thank you, everybody, for being here. I realize this is probably like the last one, I think, of the day before the one at 7, I think. So I appreciate folks kind of sticking around here. So yeah, I'll be presenting some of the findings from a research study that was done by a group of us that was led by Dr. Meredith Baroni. And we'll kind of go into what that looks like. So we'll start with just a brief introduction. We'll talk a little bit about the method, what we kind of did here. We'll go into some of the preliminary findings, some of the themes that are emerging so far, some of the implications, and then we'll wrap up with a conclusion. So I know I don't need to spend a ton of time on this, but this is just to kind of provide a foundation so we all kind of know what we're talking about going forward. So gender affirming care in this context, we define it as any form of support or intervention that supports trans and gender diverse folks in experiencing comfort or joy in their bodies and gender identity. And it can be any number of things from physical appearance related aspects, behavioral pieces, social pieces such as being correctly gendered, having folks use our correct name and pronouns. There can be medical components as well as mental and emotional pieces. So that could be things like counseling as folks navigate the process and different challenges that might emerge during that time. So it's important to note that folks can use all of these, none of these, some of these, or anything else. This is just kind of a broad sort of conceptualization of gender affirming care. So again, I know I don't need to drive this point home, but just to kind of reiterate some of the research here in terms of why GAC is important. So it can, of course, decrease gender dysphoria. That's not, of course, all it does, but that can be a piece of the puzzle. There is improvements in emotional well-being, so things like mental health, anxiety, mood, self-esteem, confidence, those pieces. It can also lead to improvements in social functioning, so building relationships, building community, and it is also related to lower rates of suicidal ideation and depression. And an important piece to note, because it kind of comes up when we talk about this later, but the research does show that receiving gender-affirming care early on for folks who desire it early on has long-term benefits versus some of the discourses that say wait till adulthood kind of thing. So it's probably no secret as to what people are saying about gender-affirming care these days. In recent years, certainly GAC and more generally the existence of trans and gender diverse folks has been very politicized and debated and surprisingly controversial. And many opponents will often spread messages such as gender-affirming care does irreversible harm, it's dangerous, it's a form of child abuse if it's administered to youth. They center detransitioning stories, which we'll talk about in a little bit. And it's also important to note that there are many proponents who are fighting for access to gender-affirming care, and their voices are, of course, very much there as well, even if the opponents are a little bit louder. And so kind of the so what of this research and why does it even matter what the media says is that media has a very strong influence and impact on our thoughts, attitudes, ideals, norms, and beliefs, both individually and kind of collectively, and also consciously and unconsciously. So we might be aware of when we're being influenced, but also we might not always be aware of how much of an influence or what exactly that influence is. And the effects can be positive, negative, anything in between. And that's also why things like misinformation can be very easily and widely spread and absorbed, particularly if the position is persuasive. So if they use things like clickbait, if they appeal to people's fears, a lot of the things that we noticed in the like anti-GAC, anti-trans articles was that they often spoke of youth. So they would appeal to the fears of parents and things like that by saying they're going to take your children away or it's going to do irreversible damage and things like that. So media will often use kind of messaging like that. So the current study, we did a critical content analysis, which is looking at different texts from news articles to identify common themes or issues that are coming up. And so we searched for these articles using the terms like gender dysphoria, gender affirming, gender transition, those sorts of things in Canadian media between 2020 and 2022. So of course, lots of content from that time. And the articles came from a wide variety of news sources with different, of course, political agendas and things like that. And so we coded the articles, so we pulled out different parts of the text into different categories and created different labels based on the messages and what was being said. So we kind of split up some of the themes, and we're still doing the analysis a little bit, into the articles that were definitely more like anti-gender affirming care, that sort of thing, into ones that were more supportive, more positive. So the news articles that were on the opponent side, there were some themes that were emerging across all of the articles. So one of them was they would misrepresent the narratives of trans and gender diverse people. So they would frame gender affirming care as problematic. They would misrepresent their experiences. They would never include actual trans and gender diverse folks. They would just put their opinions forth in incorrect ways. Another theme that came up was the use of mental health diagnoses to invalidate identity. So a lot of times the themes would be, oh, they're just anxious or depressed or traumatized and they need counseling for that. And it's nothing related to gender kind of thing. And similarly, they would say, well, if they're experiencing any kind of mental health challenges, then they don't have the capacity to make decisions about gender affirming care. So they would really put forth those kinds of messages. And the third theme that we were noticing here is the amplifying of anti-trans narratives. So they would bring in anti-trans experts, so like a doctor who was really against gender affirming care and really just like pull out their opinions and perspectives. They would also amplify like detransitioning or regret anecdotes, not in the sense of like, yes, this is something that certainly can happen, but they would frame it as, well, this is what's going to happen to everybody because we just jump right into it. Or they would even use it to say like, well, being trans isn't a real thing because people detransition, so it must not have been a real thing in the first place. So they put forward those kind of narratives. And very often there was a political kind of agenda there by saying you should vote like Republican or conservative, otherwise all these terrible things are going to happen. So there was definitely that piece to it as well. And so on the more positive side, there were articles out there that were definitely more affirmative and kind of like celebrating different advancements and really taking a positive stance, which was very much appreciated, of course. And one of the themes that came up in kind of this section of the articles was they would amplify trans affirming narratives. So they would center affirming experts, so doctors who maybe provide gender affirming care. They would actually provide firsthand accounts of trans and gender diverse folks, which is really important and really showcasing how significant gender affirming care was for them and why it's necessary, which connects to the second theme as well, where they would position gender affirming care as life-saving by showing the significance, the benefits, the outcomes in terms of quality of life, in terms of mental health, and really centering that perspective instead and providing more accurate information. So in terms of the implications for the study or this kind of research in general, again, in terms of why does it matter, just recognizing the impact that the media does have on us and how, you know, spreading misinformation or really harmful narratives has a huge impact. That's something that we cannot ignore. And in terms of how we can engage with the media, I think it's really important to, you know, for ourselves, for young folks, for anybody, to really engage in media literacy and kind of be critical about the content that we're consuming. So we want to be mindful of like, are there political or financial motives that are involved in this news article or whatever is being presented? We want to do our own kind of like fact checking to just see how many, or to see if the information is correct. And we also want to try and hold the media accountable when we can. Of course, sometimes it's hard when you're dealing with like some of these more difficult news sites who you're fairly confident will not kind of alter their opinions or anything. But seeing when it's possible to do that and when maybe we can send an email for a correction or if we can report them if it's doing harm. And in terms of the media and what the media can do, I think it's also important to consider the time and place for neutrality. A lot of institutions try and stay neutral or apolitical, but that also in itself sends a very clear message. So in not taking a stance, it's conveying that we're not going to get into it, but that also means that we're not going to support you. We're not going to stick up for you. So I think there very much is a time and place for neutrality, and it's maybe not when people are being harmed. In terms of our own social media, folks have like social media accounts and things like that, presenting accurate information or providing helpful information to folks who maybe are seeking resources or anything else. In terms of policy implications, I would also say see Evan's presentation from earlier because there are a lot of great recommendations there. And I would also say for us to kind of consider on an individual and broader scale, like what standards should be in place for media? Like what can we hold them accountable to? What standards should be in place in terms of what they can put forward? Ideally, you know, not misinformation, but I guess we're still trying to figure that out. And also, I think an important piece here is that hate speech and misinformation does not equal free speech. So a lot of times when people are opposed to gender affirming care and writing really hateful things, their argument is that it's free speech and I can say what I want, kind of thing. But that's not what free speech is. That's discrimination because it's causing harm. So I think those different pieces are very important for us to consider and for the media to consider as well. So just a brief conclusion to kind of wrap up where we're at. The study's still ongoing, so we're still kind of like analyzing and pulling out some of these themes. But just to reiterate that the media does have a significant impact on our understanding and beliefs and our perspectives, individually, collectively, culturally, and it can influence us consciously and unconsciously. So it's just important to be attuned to media and its impacts. And I do want to end on the note as well that there are articles out there that are very affirming, that are very supportive, and I think connecting with and affirming those as well is very promising. And there are certainly things that we can do on an individual and societal level that can encourage more helpful messaging, accurate information, rather than more harmful messages that will have a more negative impact. So that's all from me.